you're live.
Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight to the DevOps Live meetup. My name is Mike Rosado. I'm one of the organizers for the meetups. The other organizer that we have is John Jelinek and Ben Johnson. And they're not here today, but you might see them around in the future events. And I want to thank you all, whoever went to the DevOps Days, for attending the DevOps Days that we had here at the end of August. And just keep in mind that we're going to have more of these events coming up in the next couple of months. At the end of October, I'm going to be going to the 10th anniversary of DevOps Days in Ghent, Belgium. And most likely, John Jelinek will be here helping with the presentation of the next meetup. Also, in November 6th, I sent out an email. There was a typo. November 6th is the registration for the all-day DevOps. So if you haven't registered, go out and register. You can either watch it from your home, your office, or if you want to go, there will be a viewing party at the Container Store, and that's up on the calendar already. There'll be a viewing party out there, and you can just mingle with other people at the Container Store, those other practitioners that will be there at the viewing party as well. So tonight, I'm pleased to have the people from Army.io. They also do a product called Spinnaker. And today presenting will be Chris Franey. He's going to talk to us about safer software deployment with Spinnaker and Datadog. So without further ado, I'll just leave it over to Chris.
Hello everyone. So today we're going to talk about safer deployments using Spinnaker and Datadog. I'm really excited about this. One of the things you'll learn more is about Spinnaker and how Spinnaker really helps improve software lifecycle and just improve deployment from a safety reliability perspective. And so I'm really excited to present. So my name is Chris Franey. I'm a solutions architect with Army. And so our role is really to help customers with the adoption of Spinnaker and to just make sure that they're successful. Be a part of the ecosystem. Spinnaker is an open source project. So it really has a lot of community and around it, which we'll talk about. So yeah, so I'm here to kind of spread the word about what Spinnaker can do and share it also. So let's talk about deployments. So you know the story. So a lot of times, at least when I'm working with customers, the last question is like, how are you deploying? Or how do you get your software into production? And a lot of times we'll start out with a pretty simple answer that's pretty good. We go to dev, we go to stage, refine, and eventually you'll make it to production. But that doesn't really tell the whole story. And so it's easy to say, you have these environments and you go through this motion. But when you start to really kind of break it down and dissect it, then you start to peel back the layers and say, okay, well, now we see, okay, you have a CI system and you're doing some kind of bits. You have, you're using GitHub or similar repo changes. And you personally become partner. And like I said, you're doing all the things that you're supposed to do from a development perspective. Running integration tests, run management is now the big one. So there's updates, there's Jira tickets, there's sprints, there's all types of approvals that happen. And so, again, getting deeper and deeper and kind of dissecting and figuring out what are all the processes in between when a developer checks in code to actually hit in production. So this all looks good, right? Easy enough. Well, I want to show you this. So this is the actual exercise that we did with the customer. And what turned into those small boxes, those little boxes moving in between stages, actually turned out to be pretty complex. And so if you kind of notice here, you have different swim lanes. But a couple of things that I want to point out that is particularly interesting to me is that you do have, notice here, 31 days. You have a day here, and you have multiple days like spread out across this deployment. So if you really think about it, the deployment is spread out anywhere from 2 months, anywhere from 2 to 3 months before the actual deployment happens. And that's a lot of time. And that's not uncommon for enterprises to deploy, once a quarter, sometimes twice a year, sometimes once a year. It's not uncommon. And this is not even the worst, right? I mean, it's complex, but it's not the worst. And so the other thing I want to point out is even when you get to production, there are several things that happen in production here where you have one, their deployment was to multiple clouds, to AWS and GCP. And once they actually deploy, then if you notice here, excuse me, if you notice here, you do have input. So you have input from some monitoring tools. You see Zabbix and Jira. So there's approvals there. So even once it gets to this stage, you have to make a decision on whether or not that deployment is a good deployment and you're going to move forward, right? Or else, guess what happens? You're going to roll back. And even that process, have you ever had to roll back your deployments? If you haven't, good for you. If you have, then sometimes it can be somewhat of a messy process. You have orphan objects out there, you have things that are kind of stuck in different states. And so the whole time you're trying to roll back, it could be an outage, could have problems. So, like I said, it gets pretty complex for deployment. So, even once you kind of identify all of these different stages and all of the different steps to get to production, it still doesn't really answer all of the questions that come into play. And I know especially when it hits change management, it's one of the first questions they ask is, what's the user impact going to be? Sounds familiar, right? What's the rollback plan? That's important. And then, like I said, sometimes this deployment process starts weeks or maybe even months before. So then you have to figure out, well, what's the next deployment window? So there's all sorts of questions that kind of come into play for your deployments. Now, like good engineers, we tend to write a series of scripts to make deployments happen, right? You may start off pretty simple. You type some commands, you do some tests, you get the sequence just right, and you ultimately end up with some deployment scripts. This is all good, but then you realize you need to reuse this code to get to, say, your dev, to your stage, to your QA. So now, like many good engineers would do, you throw some parameters in there, and a lot of people use Jenkins or a similar tool. I say Jenkins, he's the friendly guy that's out there quite a bit, but people throw these scripts into Jenkins and they start to deploy. So now all of a sudden, Jenkins isn't just a CI tool, it isn't just a build tool. Now it's also used for deployments as well. Then, here comes the fun. Now you're actually using Jenkins in a whole other way that it was never intended to, right? Now you're doing an entire pipeline. Not only are you building in Jenkins, but now you're deploying in Jenkins and you're using it in ways that wasn't necessarily intended, but it gets the job done. But it can get pretty messy, right? Because Jenkins, what it doesn't really account for are the things that kind of happen during the deployment. It's great at coordinating scripts and firing off things in a timely manner, getting things done, but there's still some things to be desired. All right, so you've written your scripts, you got the whole process worked out, you've automated it, and now it's time to deploy. That's when the fun begins. Now, you've deployed, but wait, you have a problem. You have problems in your deployment. You realize you got a bunch of users calling, people going crazy. In the great words of Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Sometimes, have you ever had a bad deployment? It kind of feels like you're getting punched in the mouth, right? It stings a little bit. It really freaks people out because now they can't get to their site. Loss of productivity. You have stakeholders, business leaders who are going crazy. All these things are disruption, and you know it's all about perception, especially when today is like such an on-demand world. I mean, imagine you get in a glitch, you use maps or Waze or any type of application to get around. I mean, they deploy in the middle of the day. They deploy all the time. But it doesn't really affect you. You never really notice. But when it does, even if it's just a small glitch, you're going to feel it. And you're going to know it. You're going to be angry about it, right? That's just the world we live in today. So then the question becomes, well, how do I deploy safely? How do I do this in a reliable and a consistent manner? Well, there's a great tool that can help facilitate this, and that tool is called Spinnaker. And for those who are familiar with Spinnaker, again, Spinnaker is an open source project. It was born out of Netflix, and it was really built because Netflix experienced pain. I mean, if you think about the massive scale and the millions and millions of customers that Netflix serves every single day, you can just imagine, across, fleets of services, how daunting of a task that can be. So they have to have a way to deploy safely and receive code all the way to production from thousands of developers. So, what's Spinnaker? Straight from the Spinnaker website. Spinnaker is an open source multi-cloud continuous delivery platform. And so, what it means is, it really is a tool that it can help you deploy to multiple clouds. But a lot of companies only have one cloud that they're deploying to, and that's okay. The whole thing here with Spinnaker is, it's all about consistency, reliability, and deploying safely. No matter what target it is. It can be AWS, it can be GCP, it can be Azure, it can be Oracle, it can be Kubernetes. It doesn't really matter what the target is. It's all about safe, reliable, consistent deployments across any one of those targets at any given time of the day. So, Spinnaker really is kind of the glue that stitches the CI and CD process together. And so if you notice here, Spinnaker integrates with our CI tools like Travis and Jenkins. Excuse me. It kind of sits in the middle here, and that's pretty apparent and on purpose, right? Because what it does is, like I said, it facilitates code from going from continuous from your CI system on down to when it's deployed in your cloud environments or your infrastructure. And so the thing with that is it facilitates the different delivery mechanisms. So blue-green deployments, canary deployments, automatic rollback capability, observability. There's a ton of things that Spinnaker brings that is missing in the CI tools that have been extended to do deployments as well. And then at the bottom here, you have infrastructure. So infrastructure, Spinnaker is always aware of the infrastructure underneath. So it uses what's called a cloud driver. And that cloud driver is basically the abstraction layer across the multiple clouds that it deploys to. So it abstracts that layer so that DevOps teams, developers, they don't have to really think about how do you deploy to a particular cloud. So in other words, if you think about what you have to do from a CI perspective when you're deploying with a CI tool like Jenkins, you have to write scripts, but those scripts are pretty specific. They're specific to a certain cloud. So just using AWS as an example, you have to know how to deploy to AWS. You have to kind of know the underlying services and how to use them. And so a lot of times people don't want to spend that time. They'd rather be spending that time, building new features, writing code, instead of deployment scripts. So Spinnaker, again, is an open source project. So as an open source project, it really has a healthy community behind it. Like I said, it was born and raised out of Netflix and their deployment pains. And so if you look across the top there, some pretty big names. Like I said, I'm from Armory. Armory is actually the third largest contributor to the Spinnaker project. So we're heavily invested in it. It's our bread and butter, and that's that's what we do as a company. So we have a lot of expertise around Spinnaker. But other than that, as you can see, that number is actually changed. There's actually a lot more contributors these days, and as you can see, there's just a healthy dose of pretty big names who use Spinnaker, and this is just really a small subset. So like I said, a very vibrant, healthy community. It's growing, and so please feel free to contribute, invite contributors, believe in the project, and get to know the project. So before we get to the demo and the power of Spinnaker, just want to talk about a little bit of terminology that you'll see as I'm doing the demo. So an application in Spinnaker terminology is basically going to be the deployable unit. It's basically the service that you're deploying. The pipeline, of course, the pipeline is a pipeline. It's a series of stages, orchestrated stages, right? And then the triggers are actually going to be triggers from other upstream processes. So for instance, once a job completes in your CI system, that build can actually trigger pipelines for deployment. It could also take in things from like PubSub. So there's a number of triggers that you could actually use. You could also, if your deployment window is once every 24 hours, or you can also do cron jobs. So there's a number of triggers. There's a number of ways to actually trigger a pipeline. And a pipeline is made of stages, and these stages are essentially going to be kind of the predefined actions. They're the steps within the pipeline that's going to get your code from CI, your source repository, out to production. So now, Spinnaker and Datadog, what we are here to talk about. This is a powerful combination. The combination of these things really, like I said, it's really about safe deployments. It's not really about the number of times you can deploy in a day or a month or a year, even though that's a pretty important metric, because of course we'd all like to have increased velocity. We'd like to deploy more often. But in order to deploy more often, you did have to build kind of that confidence level. And the way you build confidence is through reliable deployments and doing it consistently and building on that. So it's an iterative process that you go through to do it. And so today, what we'll illustrate is how Datadog and Spinnaker work together to basically enable safe deployments. And so, canary analysis, if you're not familiar with how canary analysis works, it's basically a deployment strategy. And the way that it works is, so if you have a live production website, the website is receiving traffic. You have a load balancer that's sitting in front of it, that's your ingress, you're taking in traffic. And that traffic is being routed to a production environment. Now, the way the canary analysis works is it basically takes a subset of your production services. It could be instances, it could be Kubernetes. It doesn't really matter what you're deploying to. It's going to take a subset of that infrastructure. It's going to stand it up, and that's going to become your baseline. And so the baseline, like I said, is basically, if you notice here, the baseline is going to be version 1.0. So the canary instance is basically going to be the new version of your software or your application. And the canary version is going to be deployed alongside of the baseline. And so you're then going to shift a subset of traffic to the canary instance. And so the way that works is it's going to actually compare the baseline and the canary to basically determine whether or not it's a safe deployment. And so the way that it does that is through collecting metrics. And so that's where Datadog really comes into the picture. Datadog is collecting the metrics, it holds all the metrics of all your applications. So having the visibility into anything from just simple CPU memory onto error rates, actually application level metrics are pretty much, there's no limit. If it's in Datadog, the Kyantis, or the service in Spinnaker is called Kyantis. That service is basically going to make a judgment based on what it measures between the baseline and the canary. And so at the end of that, you basically have an idea of whether or not it was a safe deployment. And so there's a judgment that actually happens at the end of that, to where now that you have, it's basically like a score. So it assigns it a score, and if it falls below a certain threshold, then the deployment is not going to go to production. If it goes above or it's higher than a certain threshold, then it's pretty much deemed as a safe deployment. Now the ultimate goal here is to have that automated. And again, it's an iterative process, so although you may not be here out of the box first pass, as you deploy more and more, and you learn more through this process, at some point you're going to trust the deployments enough to remove the manual gate. And there are companies who have removed that manual gate, so now their deployments are automated. So, demo time. So we're going to do a demo, and let's go here. Let's refresh. Can everyone see that? Okay. So, so this is the UI for Spinnaker. Now, what we have here, I have a pipeline that I've pre-configured. And so if you take a look at this pipeline, every pipeline in Spinnaker basically starts with a configuration. That configuration is essentially where the triggers, where you have triggers, you define your triggers, your parameters, artifacts, and things that you're going to use in your subsequent stages. And so, for a bit of configuration, I have to zoom out a little bit. Sorry. If you can still see that. But as you can see, as part of my configuration, I'm pulling in some artifacts here from GitHub. And I'm basically going to use these artifacts to basically deploy. This is basically going to be my latest version of my application. Automated triggers, again, as you can see, I'm going to run this manually today, but as you can see, it's integrated with Jenkins. So as soon as that job completes, Spinnaker commits. If I check code in, it's going to do its build, it's going to complete, and it's going to trigger this pipeline. And then parameters, again, like I said, I can do parameters for things like environments, or so maybe I want to deploy, or maybe I have some custom parameters that I want to input. You also input these as well as part of the pipeline. And then of course notifications. It can be Slack. If you like email and you like to get spammed, email is fine too. But you get notifications. So if we go back here, there's now a stage that we call get baseline image. So essentially what this is doing is, in order to build that baseline, it's going and taking a look at what's currently deployed. And so it's going to basically go and take the existing deployment. It knows what's deployed, it knows the image that's been deployed, and now it's going to use that to deploy the baseline. And so as you can see, Spinnaker basically has a language that it uses called SPEL, which stands for Spring Expression Language. But as you can see, I've used basically this baseline that I found from the previous stage, and that's what I'm essentially using to build a baseline. Now, this is text. You could also do this as an artifact. So if I specified an artifact in the beginning, then I could also deploy that artifact as well. So, and then you see the deploy canary. So the canary, as you'll notice here, has a different image. And so this image, again, is going to be based on that Jenkins job and the output. So that trigger is that build number that comes from the Jenkins job. So the next step here is canary analysis. Now this is where kind of the magic happens, right? So it's basically ingesting this data. And again, you can specify basically the sample size. So if you notice here, so I have my config name, which is essentially going to be my config that I'm pulling Datadog metrics for. It's basically almost like a profile. And then, like I said, you can set a lifetime, which is essentially going to be how long you want to monitor this new canary. And then essentially you're saying, you're specifying your baseline and your canary, and that's it. And the last thing to point out here is these are the thresholds that you want to set. Now, these are adjustable, of course. So maybe in order to pass, you need to be at 90% for it to be a good deployment. But totally customizable. So as we're going to move on, so the canary analysis is, like I said, where that judgment is going to actually happen. And so once you have passed, if it passes, then as you can see, there's a branch here that says promote to production. So essentially, if it's above the threshold that you set, then a promote to production is basically going to then scale up that canary, basically, or scale up your environment. It's going to build a new cluster, scale up. And then it's going to basically delete the canary in the baseline. So if it does fail, if it doesn't meet whatever threshold that you specify, then the pipeline is essentially not going to execute this promote to production. Okay? So, I'm just gonna go back and I'm gonna execute this. And while this is running, it's probably gonna take a few minutes. So, like I said, I just want to show you. Now I want to show you what it actually looks like when it completed. So I ran this one last night. So as you can see, the green stages, of course, means that it succeeded. And so as you can see, it successfully got the baseline image. It successfully deployed the canary and the baseline. And then, if you look at the canary analysis, so what you see here is, here are all of the analysis that took place. Like I said, I had a basically an interval set at, or a time period set at 10 minutes. So what you see is over 10 minutes, it basically checked every minute for 10 minutes. And so by doing that, as you can see, my score ended up being a 60. Now, if you think about where my thresholds are, my thresholds are set between 50 and 70. Meaning 70 is at the top range of it, right? And so obviously it wasn't above 70, so it deemed the deployment not to be safe, and it stopped the deployment. But what I want to point out here is, like I said, it basically has taken an average every minute of this deployment. And so so you can actually look at like each one of these reports. So the metrics that you're actually collecting, again, this is all from Datadog, these metrics. And so this is a fairly, sorry, I have to zoom out here. For this particular one, for this particular example, as you can see, we're just simply collecting CPU, I/O, and memory. But again, you can get pretty granular. Like I said, pretty much, if it's in Datadog, you can pull out any metric and use that for canary analysis. And so what you'll see here is, on this particular pass, it's 100%, right? But if you scroll down, like I said, these metrics are essentially what Spinnaker is using to compare and how it derives this score. So going back, actually, one thing to point out here, since I'm here, the canary configs. This is basically the profile that you're going to set. So, so if you drill down into this profile, as you can see, these are metrics that we're gathering from Datadog. But like I said, this is completely customizable to whatever you can check for things like latency, error rates, cache misses, whatever metrics that you're monitoring in your application, you can capture here and use as part of that judgment. And then, as you can see, you have the scoring part. So this is how it comes up with the scoring. And this is customizable as well. It must equal 100%. And so As you can see, as far as the weight here is the highest weight. So basically, if you see a CPU spike, then obviously it's gonna weigh into that score heavier.
So I have a question.
Sure.
So a pass is 100, right? 100 of what? Like, if my IO is, if my score is, I just care about IO, 100 IOs? Like, what are we measuring? How does the IO performance translate into the 3-digit number of 100 or 90 or whatever?
Yeah. So again, it's really all about like the threshold, right? And so this is all. Let me go back here. So kind of drilling down into this report, right? If you can see, let me zoom in here. So as you can see, like it's given a passing score for memory, CPU. Actually, CPU actually doesn't have any data there. So actually, this 100% is actually based on I/O and memory. For some reason, it didn't get a CPU reporting there. So
Is that percent difference from the baseline?
yeah,
Okay.
yes, exactly. So again, just going back to my analysis here. So again, so the average actually ended up working out to 60% on this particular run, right? And so if you notice here, so again, because the deployment was 60%, which wasn't above my threshold, then it didn't promote it to production. And it deleted the canary and deleted the baseline. And that was the end of the pipeline. So one of the things that one of the things that we've seen with like customers implement is, so even if you promote to production, like you can still have rollback capabilities. You can still do some type of check, even once it hits production, right? And then from there, you can build another pipeline that actually carries out your rollback. So remember the triggers that I said. Actually, one of the triggers is if you notice here, pipeline. So after you deploy it to production, if that fails, if that production release fails, then you can actually have it to go and trigger this particular pipeline, and then the next pipeline can be a rollback pipeline, for instance. So you can automate that entire process, the canary and the rollback, the entire deployment, the whole life cycle can be deployed with Spinnaker. So. Any questions there?
Where's Datadog getting its metrics from? Is it collecting it as a sidecar in your cluster, or?
No, so it's actually all API.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have to run an agent on your.
You can do it that way. So if you want like deeper metrics, then yes, you can run an agent as a sidecar. You can do it that way. So it's really flexible. This particular, since it's really only CPU memory, it's just using API.
Okay.
So Spinnaker, so on that note, Spinnaker actually has built-in out-of-the-box integration, and this is an open source version with Datadog, Prometheus, and Stackdriver. So those are the three that support it out of the box. So there's a way to configure, if you have other tools like Splunk or any other tool that you have that you want to send metrics to. That could also be configured, but then it would be, if it's not native, then you can deploy like a sidecar.
So where and how have you configured base image, production image?
So, I'm sorry?
Like as you do constant deployments, how do you configure what is my base image, what is my new production image?
So how do you know which one is production? So, again, like if you take so there's a couple of ways. There's many ways you can do it actually. So, you can take the expected artifacts. So you can actually like parameterize a lot of these things. And so, like if you have a certain, construct of your build, or deployment names or something like that, you can grab it based on like versions. You can grab it, it's probably easier for me to do this. So you could match it against, so basically that's another thing. So you can do things like, as soon as a new Docker image hits a registry, right? That's gonna be your deployable artifact. You can grab that. So there's a number of ways like you can grab versions. In this particular, I don't know if you kind of noticed this when I triggered this pipeline, but let me go back. In this particular case, these are all the builds, right? So these are all through, just testing and demoing this, right? If I actually went and made a commit, then it's gonna increment that build number. Now I'm gonna have build 37. So I'm taking basically the latest image, right? And so that's where like the Spring expression language, you could either use that to like pull some value that, or like I said, you can define it as expected artifact or grab it, latest version in this way. Any other questions? All right, so we're just at about 10 minutes. Let's see if it moves on here. Still running slightly fast. It looks like this one went to about 11 minutes. It's probably, and the reason why it's actually going to 11 minutes is because if you look at the canary, so let's go here. So I said a 1 minute delay. So it didn't even start until the first minute. So now it's collecting 10 minutes worth, so that's why it's going to 11 minutes. So that should be done here shortly, but yeah. Actually, let's look at one thing. So you can actually check it and see. So it looks like this one might actually pass. We have a lot of 100s there. So let's see if this one, like I said, we had a failure. I'll show you what a failure looks like. So we'll see what a successful pipeline looks like.
How is the traffic diverted to different deployments? Say database, Lambda, or CCS. So how is the traffic actually?
Yeah, so that could actually, so that's something that could be orchestrated in Spinnaker as well. So yeah, you can shift like percentages of traffic, especially if it's like a native like AWS service. It, like I said, it has hooks built in.
So Spinnaker has to be deployed as part of your environment, just not the deployment tool.
So, I'm sorry, what's
In terms of routing the live traffic, do you require a Spinnaker component in your environment, or is it?
So if it's not, so if you're not using like native like AWS services, if you're using some other third-party tooling or something like that, however you interact with those devices or appliances, whether it's through API calls or scripts or whatever, it can do that. Like it can fire that off. It's extremely flexible. So let me just point this out while this is happening. So as you can see, so our canary score, and so because it is above our threshold, it's actually going out, and now it's actually doing the promotion, and this is Kubernetes. So you can see it's deploying a replica set there. So there's also stages to actually scale up and scale down clusters as well. So, but this is so yeah, that's really what it looks like. So it was it deployed. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you know if his Spinnaker works with canary deployments, specifically with Trafic as ingress control?
As
Trafic.
oh, okay. Like I said, it's not native integration, but however you interact with it, whether it's a RESTful API or scripts or however you interact with it, you can pretty much do it in Spinnaker. So
Okay.
it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter.
Doesn't
Like I said,
matter.
if there's an API or a shell script, it doesn't really matter. They can run it. So yeah. All right. So that concludes it. So that's so as you can see, it went through the entire pipeline. Did a canary analysis, did the judgment. So that's how you can do it in really an automated fashion. And like I said, you can also, put, just to point out here, remember I said, you sometimes, you may want to put up a manual gate. Like I said, until you kind of, get confidence in your deployments. There's, you could like potentially say, for instance, there's different stages here, but one of the stages is, a manual judgment. So you could actually like put this manual judgment. Anyway, what I want to point out is you could actually put a manual judgment here. And even though this is a pretty simple stage, it's rather powerful because now you can put inputs like, say did this deploy? Yep. And it can be as simple as a yes and a no. One of my other favorites is you may want to make a judgment on like what cloud you want to deploy to based on the particular outcome of that canary. So for instance, if you need to do some additional integration tests because it failed, you may want to send it to say AWS. And so this judgment can basically, be different selections for your clouds. So there's again, arbitrary values, but the way that you actually consume those is basically a conditional expression to basically say if this equals, say, AWS, then continue with this stage, or if it equals something, yes or no. If it's no, then fail the deployment, right? So, pretty powerful.
And I'm assuming it has integration with pushback all the way to the Git repo that says whether or not it's been deployed or failing or whatever else in terms of badges.
So sorry, what was your question?
Can you put a badge on your Git repo or on your build pipeline that says this build has succeeded or failed deployment?
Oh yeah. I mean, because it's still API call,
Yeah.
right? And so there's a webhook stage that you can go with, like query that job and status and all doable. All right. So
is this well suited only for cloud or even for in-house data center?
So as a community, kind of the preferred method is Kubernetes. It doesn't have to be deployed on Kubernetes, but it's the easiest to deploy on Kubernetes because there's already kind of the pre-constructed
Kubernetes, I
tooling.
understand, let's say if I have Nginx and all to spread traffic to Kubernetes and I have it on my data center, still.
You can still do it, yeah, absolutely. You can deploy it really anywhere. Like I said, you can deploy it on EC2 instances or whatever cloud. It doesn't have to be a Kubernetes cluster. Like I said, it's kind of the preferred method, especially if you're running in say one of the cloud providers. You can set up an EKS cluster and deploy it and have it running in less than an hour up and deploy. But yeah, it's pretty trivial. So. Which we have a webinar that we run. It's basically standing up Spinnaker in 30 minutes or less. But like I said, it's that's using a Kubernetes cluster. So like I said, it's easier to do, but
And
it's not.
Spinnaker comes into picture when CI is done, when an image is built or so.
Absolutely. So a couple of things, just some resources that you can use to learn more about Spinnaker. There's a GitHub repo, and if you're using Slack, there's a Slack channel for Spinnaker, and Armory is in there as well. So I'm in there as well as all the other engineers, and so always happy to answer any questions that you have as well. And we also have Armory docs. So the reason I call it Armory docs is because a lot of the docs there are Spinnaker related. They're not, it's like I said, it's mostly based on open source. So where Spinnaker IO docs kind of leaves off, Armory adds a little bit more flavor there, a little more context. So I encourage you to check out those documents as well. And then, like I said, Spinnaker IO is the source of truth. So and just Armory as a company. So Armory as a company, we build enterprise Spinnaker. So just from an enterprise perspective, open source projects are great. But there's, as we know, there's all sorts of things that enterprises need that sometimes open source projects don't have. And so that's what Armory does. We build enterprise integrations, things like policy engine, pipelines as code, things like that that make Spinnaker robust for enterprises. So. And yeah, that's it. Thank you. So Ian Lai, a colleague, he is the account executive at Spinnaker, joining me today, and so we appreciate it. And thank you.
Thank you very much for coming out.